My stepmom always said I'd never be as successful as her real children, so I bought the company she owned. Growing up, Vivian made it crystal clear I was the consolation prize in every possible way. When Dad married her, I was 8 and desperately wanted a mom figure after losing my biological mother to cancer 2 years earlier. Stepmom had 2 kids from her previous marriage, twins who could do no wrong in her eyes. Meanwhile, I couldn't breathe without disappointing her in some fundamental way. Every family dinner was a carefully orchestrated performance where her kids showcased their achievements while I sat silent, learning to make myself invisible. When I made honor roll, she'd mention how the twins made dean's list at their prestigious prep school. When I got into college with partial scholarships I'd worked desperately to earn, she'd remind everyone how her daughter got a full scholarship to Princeton and how her son was recruited by 3 Ivy League schools. When I started my first job at a local accounting firm, grateful just to have steady income, she'd compare my entry-level salary to her son's promotion at his investment banking position that his godfather had secured for him. The comparisons were relentless and surgical, designed to cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability. At family barbecues, she'd introduce the twins as her brilliant children who were destined for greatness, then add almost as an afterthought that I was Dad's daughter from his previous marriage, usually with a sympathetic smile that suggested I was some kind of charity case they'd graciously taken in. She'd give them expensive gifts for minor accomplishments, a new car for making varsity tennis, designer clothes for getting a B+ on an exam, while handing me practical items like socks or notebooks with a lecture about the value of being sensible and realistic about one's station in life. When relatives asked about my achievements, she'd redirect the conversation to her kids' latest successes, or she'd damn me with faint praise that highlighted my limitations. She'd say things like, well, we can't all be gifted like the twins, but she's very hardworking, or she does her best with what she has to work with. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and unrelenting. She'd schedule important family meetings when I had to work, then act disappointed that I wasn't more committed to family time. She'd plan family vacations during my finals week, expressing surprise that my education wasn't flexible enough to accommodate family priorities. At Christmas, the twins would receive multiple expensive gifts while I'd get one practical item and a lecture about the importance of not being materialistic. She'd explain to relatives that she was teaching me valuable lessons about earning what I received and not expecting handouts like some children who had been spoiled by their circumstances. She had a particular talent for undermining my accomplishments in ways that seemed supportive on the surface. When I won a regional academic competition, she congratulated me while mentioning how much more prestigious the national competition was and how disappointed she was that I hadn't qualified for that level. When I got my first promotion at work, she celebrated by explaining to the family how different industries had different standards and how my promotion was equivalent to what the twins had accomplished straight out of college in more demanding fields. The worst part? Dad never defended me. He'd just smile and nod while she systematically destroyed my confidence, piece by carefully calculated piece. When I'd try to talk to him privately about how her words hurt, about how I felt like an outsider in my own home, he'd say stepmom was just trying to motivate me, that her high standards would make me stronger in the long run and prepare me for a world that wouldn't coddle me. He'd explain that she came from a successful family and knew what it took to achieve real success. Unlike him who had married young and never finished college, he was grateful for her guidance in raising me properly, he'd say, as if I was some kind of feral child who needed taming. When I'd point out specific instances of favoritism or cruelty, he'd minimize them or reframe them as learning opportunities. When I'd show him the disparity in how she treated me versus the twins, he'd explain that different children needed different approaches, and that I was more resilient than they were. The gaslighting was so consistent and pervasive that I began to question my own perceptions. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining the malice in her words. Maybe I really was lucky to have someone willing to push me to be better than I would have been on my own. They didn't make me stronger. They made me desperate to prove myself, consumed with a need for validation that felt like drowning in plain sight. During high school, I worked 3 part-time jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, hoping to finally earn some recognition or maybe just basic acknowledgement of my efforts. I tutored younger students after school, worked weekends at a retail store, and cleaned offices at night, saving every penny for college because I knew there'd be no family money coming my way. The twins coasted through private school on mediocre grades while getting praised for their potential and natural intelligence. When they struggled with classes, stepmom hired expensive tutors and blamed the teachers for not challenging them appropriately. When I struggled, I was told to work harder and stop making excuses. My bedroom was in the basement, which stepmom had converted into a living space that she proudly showed off to guests as evidence of how well she'd accommodated her inherited stepdaughter. The twins had adjoining rooms on the second floor with private bathrooms and walk-in closets. When friends came over, they had to use the back entrance to reach my room, which stepmom explained was more appropriate since my space was separate from the main family areas. The message was clear. I was part of the household but not part of the family. During my junior year, I applied for a prestigious summer internship that would look excellent on college applications. When I was selected, stepmom congratulated me before explaining that the family had already planned a summer vacation that I couldn't miss. The internship would have to be declined because family commitments came first. The twins spent that summer at expensive camps and enrichment programs that would enhance their college application. I spent it working at a local restaurant to save money for school supplies. When graduation came, stepmom attended their ceremony with flowers, a professional photographer, and a celebration dinner at the country club. She missed mine because she had a migraine that mysteriously appeared that morning and disappeared by evening when the twins wanted to go shopping. College was 4 years of working multiple jobs while watching my social media feeds fill with photos of the twins at parties, spring break trips, and exclusive events that stepmom funded without question. I ate ramen noodles and studied in the library because my dorm was too noisy, while they posted pictures from expensive restaurants and designer shopping trips. I majored in computer science with a minor in business, choosing practical fields that would lead to stable employment rather than following any particular passion. The twins majored in liberal arts at expensive private schools, confident that their connections would lead to opportunities regardless of their academic performance. During my sophomore year, I developed a software application that helped local businesses manage their inventory more efficiently. I started licensing it to small companies and made enough money to reduce my work hours and focus more on studies. When I told the family about my success, stepmom expressed concern that I was becoming too focused on money and not developing the social skills and cultural awareness that would serve me better in the long run. She worried that my entrepreneurial activities were making me antisocial and overly focused on immediate gratification rather than long-term character development. The twins changed majors multiple times, extended their college careers, and took gap years to find themselves, while stepmom praised their thoughtfulness and refusal to be rushed into decisions that weren't right for them. After college, I threw myself into work with an intensity that worried my friends and concerned my professors who tried to maintain contact. While her precious twins partied through their 20s on trust fund money and connections handed to them like participation trophies, I built a tech consulting business from absolutely nothing. 18-hour days became my normal. No social life, no dating, no hobbies. Just pure determination fueled by years of being told I wasn't enough and would never be enough. I slept in my office more nights than I slept at home. I lived on coffee and whatever food clients left in conference rooms after meetings. I started small, taking contracts other firms rejected as too difficult, unprofitable, or impossible to complete within the given timeframes. While the twins bounced between entry-level positions at companies where their connections got them hired despite their lack of qualifications or work ethic, I was pulling all-nighters to deliver impossible projects on time and under budget. My first major client was a manufacturing company whose entire computer system had crashed during a critical production period. They'd been quoted 6 weeks and $50,000 to restore their operations. I did it in 10 days for $30,000, working around the clock and sleeping in their break room. Word spread quickly in the business community about the young consultant who could solve problems other firms couldn't handle. I specialized in rescuing failing tech implementations, streamlining inefficient systems, and turning around companies that were hemorrhaging money due to technological incompetence. Every client I gained, every problem I solved, every late payment I chased down personally, every technical challenge I conquered was another small victory against stepmom's voice in my head, telling me I'd never amount to anything significant. My business grew slowly at first, then exponentially as word spread about my ability to deliver results. Within 2 years, I hired my first employee. Within 3 years, I had a small team of consultants working under my direction. Within 5 years, I had 30 employees and was turning away projects because we couldn't handle the volume. The work was demanding and stressful, but it was mine. Every decision, every success, every failure belonged to me. I wasn't succeeding because of family connections or inherited advantages. I was building something from nothing through pure competence and determination. Within 8 years, I was acquiring smaller firms and expanding internationally. I opened offices in 3 major cities and was pulling in more revenue annually than stepmom's inherited company. But I never mentioned it at family gatherings because I'd learned that success only made her criticism more cutting and personal. Instead of being proud of my accomplishments, stepmom seemed threatened by them. She'd make subtle comments about people who worked too hard and neglected their personal development. She'd express concern that I was becoming too focused on material success and missing out on the cultural experiences that truly enriched a person's life. When I bought my first house at 25, she toured it with a critical eye and mentioned how important it was to invest in appreciating assets rather than just seeking immediate gratification through material possessions. The twins were still living in apartments that stepmom subsidized while they figured out their career paths. When I started appearing in local business publications, stepmom would cut out the articles and express hope that the recognition wouldn't go to my head. She'd remind me that true success was measured by the positive impact you had on others, not by personal achievements or financial metrics. My stepmom owned a mid-sized marketing firm that she'd inherited from her first husband after he died of a heart attack when the twins were in high school. She'd constantly brag about being a successful businesswoman at dinner parties, usually while mentioning how I'd never understand real leadership because I lacked natural business instincts and the proper breeding that came from growing up in successful families. She'd hold court at family gatherings, discussing her latest business strategies and client acquisitions, always making sure I was within earshot when she'd add observations about how some people just weren't born with entrepreneurial instincts, or how success required more than just hard work. It required vision and breeding and connections that couldn't be taught. She'd talk about the importance of legacy and building something meaningful to pass down to future generations, pointedly looking at the twins while explaining how real success meant creating something that would last beyond one's lifetime, not just grinding away at small-scale projects that anyone could do with enough desperation. The company her first husband had built was respectable, but not particularly innovative. They handled traditional marketing campaigns for established local businesses, relying on relationships and reputation rather than cutting-edge strategies or technological advancement. Under stepmom's leadership, the company had remained stable but stagnant. She was risk-averse and suspicious of new approaches, preferring to stick with proven methods rather than adapt to changing market conditions. This conservative approach had served her well during the economic uncertainty of the previous decade, but it left the company vulnerable as the business landscape evolved. 5 years ago, her company started struggling badly, and I watched from the sidelines as her empire slowly crumbled under the weight of poor decisions and stubborn pride. Bad investments in outdated technology that she'd insisted was cutting edge, losing clients to more innovative competitors who understood digital transformation, outdated strategies that hadn't evolved with a rapidly changing media landscape. The decline started gradually. Long-term clients began reducing their budgets or moving portions of their business to competitors who offered more modern services. Younger businesses chose other firms from the start, finding stepmom's company old-fashioned and out of touch with contemporary marketing approaches. She was too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to admit that the business world had changed around her while she'd been resting on the reputation her late husband had built. The twins offered to help, but neither had any business experience beyond their trust funds and the entry-level positions they'd abandoned when the work became too demanding. When the twins did try to contribute, their suggestions were naive and impractical. They'd propose expensive rebranding campaigns or celebrity endorsements that demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the company's financial situation and market position. Stepmom would listen to their ideas with the same indulgent attention she'd always given them, implementing their suggestions even when her experienced employees warned against them. The results were predictably disastrous, but she blamed external factors rather than acknowledging that her children's advice had been counterproductive. I found myself checking her company's financial reports, which were public records since they'd gone public years earlier. Revenue declining year over year, major clients terminating contracts, key employees leaving for competitors. Her leadership team was jumping ship, and industry publications were publishing articles about the company's struggles with barely concealed glee. The business press loves a fall from grace story, especially when it involves someone who'd been publicly arrogant about their success. Stepmom had given numerous interviews over the years, positioning herself as a thought leader in marketing, often making dismissive comments about newer firms that relied on technology rather than relationship building. Those same publications were now dissecting her company's decline with the enthusiasm of vultures circling a dying animal. Former employees were giving anonymous quotes about mismanagement and resistance to change. Competitors were poaching clients with promises of more modern approaches and better results. Part of me wanted to offer assistance, to swallow my pride and extend an olive branch that might finally bridge the gap between us. I had the technical expertise and business experience to help turn the company around. My consulting firm had successfully rescued dozens of struggling businesses in similar situations. But every time I considered it, every time I drafted an email or picked up the phone, I'd remember her voice telling me I'd never understand real business because I wasn't born with the right instincts. I'd remember family dinners where she'd explain to guests that some people were natural leaders, while others were just worker bees who could execute other people's visions, but could never create anything meaningful themselves. I'd remember the countless times she'd dismissed my suggestions or insights, explaining that I lacked the experience and wisdom to understand the complexities of running a real business, rather than just providing technical services to other people's companies. Last month, her business went up for sale after months of increasingly desperate financial difficulties. The asking price was steep for a struggling company, but I'd been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. My consulting firm had grown exponentially over the past decade, acquiring smaller companies throughout North America and expanding into European markets. I had the cash reserves to make the purchase without financing, which put me at a significant advantage over other potential buyers who would need loans or investor backing. My financial advisors questioned the wisdom of buying a declining marketing firm when my tech consulting business was thriving, but I convinced them it was a strategic diversification play. The due diligence process revealed the full extent of the company's problems. Outdated systems, declining client relationships, demoralized employees, and questionable financial practices that bordered on fraud. Any rational buyer would have walked away or demanded a significant reduction in price. But this wasn't a rational business decision. This was personal. I discovered that stepmom had been siphoning money from the company for years, using business accounts to fund the twins' lifestyles and her own expensive tastes. Consulting fees paid to shell companies that provided no actual services. Personal expenses charged to business accounts and disguised as legitimate costs. The most egregious discovery was that she'd been using company funds to pay for the twins' graduate school tuition, their apartment rents, their car payments, and their credit card bills. She'd structured these payments as salaries for part-time work that existed only on paper. When confronted with this evidence during negotiations, her lawyers claimed it was standard practice for family businesses and that the payments were legitimate compensation for the twins' contributions to company strategy and development. I had my forensic accountants document everything meticulously, not because I planned to pursue criminal charges, but because I knew this information would be valuable leverage in the future. When my lawyer called to finalize the purchase after weeks of negotiations and due diligence, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete vindication mixed with terrifying power and the surreal sensation that I was living someone else's life. The paperwork was signed yesterday afternoon in a conference room overlooking the city, with lawyers and accountants and financial advisors discussing terms and conditions, while I signed my name to documents that made me the owner of my stepmom's life's work. Today, I'm walking into my new office building to fire my stepmom from her own company, and I still can't believe this moment is finally here. I arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, wearing my most expensive suit, the one I'd bought to celebrate landing my biggest client the previous year, but had never found an occasion special enough to wear until now. The receptionist looked confused when I introduced myself as the new owner, explaining that word hadn't spread through the company yet, and that an all-hands meeting would be scheduled for later that morning. The building itself was impressive but dated, like everything else about stepmom's approach to business. Marble floors and wood paneling that had been luxurious 20 years ago, but now looked tired and old-fashioned. The technology was outdated, the furniture was worn, and the overall atmosphere was that of a company living in the past. Stepmom was in her corner office, probably updating her LinkedIn profile to find a new position or calling her network to see what opportunities might be available for someone of her stature and experience. I knocked once on her door and entered without waiting for permission, just as she'd done countless times in my childhood when she'd barged into my room to criticize my organization or study habits. She looked up from her computer, irritation flashing across her face, until she registered who I was standing in her doorway. For a moment, confusion replaced irritation, as she tried to process why I would be in her office during business hours. "What are you doing here?" she snapped. her voice carrying the same dismissive tone I'd heard my entire life. This is a place of business, not somewhere for family visits or whatever this is supposed to be. I smiled and sat down across from her massive mahogany desk, the one she'd always used to intimidate employees, clients, and anyone else who dared to question her authority or decisions. The chair was expensive leather, probably chosen more for its impressive appearance than its comfort. "I'm here as the new owner," I said simply, watching her face for the exact moment when my words registered and their meaning became clear. The color drained from her face as if someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood run out. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again as she struggled to process what I just told her. "That's impossible," she stammered, her voice losing its usual authority and command. The buyer was some tech company from out of state. The lawyers never mentioned any family connection or personal involvement in this transaction. "Rodriguez Holdings, that's my company." I pulled out the purchase agreement and placed it on her desk, right on top of the family photo where she stood between the twins at their college graduation. "Effective immediately, you're terminated. Security will escort you out in 10 minutes. The photo showed all three of them beaming at the camera, stepmom's arms around her children's shoulders in a gesture of pride and possession that had never included me. I had taken the photo myself, standing outside their circle of success and achievement. She stared at the papers, then at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water and gasping for air. Her hands trembled as she reached for the documents, scanning them frantically as if she could find some loophole or error that would make this nightmare disappear. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice losing all its usual authority and command. "This company is my life, my reputation. Everything I've built over the past 15 years. Everything your first husband built," I corrected, leaning back in the chair and enjoying the way she flinched at my words. "You just inherited it and ran it into the ground while taking credit for his vision and connections." Her shock transformed into the familiar rage I'd seen so many times when anyone dared to challenge her version of reality or suggest that she might be anything less than perfect. But this time the rage was mixed with desperation and genuine fear. "You vindictive little brat," she hissed, standing up and leaning over the desk with her hands flat on the surface. "After everything I did for you, after I welcomed you into my home and treated you like my own child, what exactly did you do for me?" I stood up, leaning over her precious desk and meeting her fury with calm determination. "Tell me one supportive thing you've ever said. One time you believed in me. One moment where you treated me like family instead of an inconvenience you had to tolerate." The office fell silent except for the sound of her rapid breathing and the distant hum of air conditioning. She opened her mouth several times as if to respond, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in her life, she was speechless. That's what I thought. The security team arrived right on schedule. Two professional guards who'd been briefed on the situation and knew to be respectful but firm. They'd worked in corporate environments before and understood the delicate nature of executive terminations. As they gathered her personal items from the office she'd occupied for over a decade, stepmom made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation and salvage some dignity from this humiliation. "Your father will never forgive you for this," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. "He'll see this for what it really is, a cruel, vindictive attack on his wife by his jealous, unstable daughter." I paused at the doorway and turned back to look at her one final time, taking in the sight of the woman who'd tormented me for 20 years, now reduced to a defeated figure being escorted from her own office. "Dad's been getting monthly reports about your company's financial troubles for the past year," I said calmly. "He knew I was the buyer before I signed the papers. He also knows about the money you've been siphoning from the business accounts to fund the twins' lifestyle." Her face went white as she realized the implications of what I'd just revealed. Not only had I destroyed her professional life, but I'd also exposed her criminal activities to the one person whose opinion she valued most. "We found everything during due diligence," I continued. "The fake consulting fees to shell companies, the personal expenses charged to business accounts, the inflated salaries for part-time work that was never actually performed, the tax evasion schemes you thought were too clever for anyone to notice. Dad's been asking questions about where his retirement investments went, and now he has his answers." As security escorted her out of the building, she kept turning back to stare at me with pure, undiluted hatred, as if she could somehow reverse what had happened through the force of her fury alone. Other employees watched from their cubicles and offices, whispering among themselves about the dramatic change in leadership. 3 hours later, after meeting with the remaining department heads and beginning the process of assessing which employees were worth retaining, Dad called my cell phone. His voice sounded different, older, more fragile, as if he'd aged years in the space of a morning. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, his voice sounding older than I'd ever heard it. "Which part?" "All of it." I took a deep breath, standing in the office that had been stepmom's just that morning and looking out at the city skyline. This was the conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating for years. "Yes, I bought her company. Yes, I fired her. And yes, she's been stealing from you for years." A long pause filled with the weight of 20 years of willful blindness and misplaced loyalty. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, probably sitting in his home office surrounded by the life he'd built with stepmom. "How long have you known? About her stealing? 6 months? Since the forensic accountants started their review? About wanting to buy her company? 5 years, since I first realized I had the resources to make it happen. About needing to prove myself? My entire life." Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I failed you," he said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. "I let her treat you terribly because I was afraid of losing her, afraid of being alone again after your mother died. I thought if I just kept the peace, if I didn't rock the boat, somehow everything would work out for everyone. You chose her over me every single time," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. even when you knew she was wrong, even when you could see how much her words hurt me, even when I begged you to stand up for me just once. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. His voice broke completely, and for the first time in 20 years, I heard genuine remorse from the man who was supposed to protect me, but had thrown me to the wolves instead. The twins called me this morning, he continued after regaining his composure. They're furious. They want to contest the sale, claim you manipulated me into approving it, or that you used insider information illegally. Can they? No. It was a legitimate business transaction handled by teams of lawyers and accountants. Besides, I reviewed everything before giving my approval as Vivian's spouse and business partner. You paid more than fair market value for a failing company. If anything, you overpaid significantly. I didn't buy it for the money. I know. I understand that now. That evening, I sat in stepmom's former office, going through files and planning the massive restructuring that would be necessary to save the company. The business could be saved, but it would require completely rebuilding the toxic culture she'd created and updating systems that hadn't been properly maintained in years. Her computer was still logged in, and I spent several hours reviewing her email correspondence from the past year. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd imagined. Clients complaining about poor service and outdated approaches, employees expressing frustration with management decisions, vendors threatening to discontinue service due to late payments. Most disturbing were the emails between stepmom and the twins, where she complained bitterly about my success and discussed various schemes to undermine my business reputation. She'd even contacted some of my clients, suggesting that my company was unreliable and that they should consider switching to more established firms. My phone buzzed constantly with text messages from the twins, starting with confusion and escalating to threats and accusations. My stepbrother wrote, "You've destroyed our family. Mom's devastated. How could you be so cruel to someone who raised you and loved you like her own daughter?" My stepsister added, "This is psychotic behavior. You need professional help. We're consulting lawyers about having you committed for a psychiatric evaluation. This level of vindictiveness isn't normal." The messages continued throughout the evening, becoming increasingly desperate and hostile. They accused me of elder abuse, corporate fraud, manipulation, and various other crimes that demonstrated their complete misunderstanding of basic business law. I stared at the messages for a long time before responding to both of them in a group text. I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped pretending we were ever a family. The response was immediate and vicious. They accused me of being a sociopath, of harboring resentment for decades, of being incapable of forgiveness or love. They threatened to expose my vindictive nature to my clients and destroy my business reputation. I turned off my phone and spent the rest of the evening reviewing company financial records and planning the turnaround strategy that would be necessary to save the business. The next few weeks were brutal in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Stepmom hired the most expensive lawyers she could find, claiming I'd manipulated Dad and stolen her company through fraudulent means. She gave interviews to local business publications, painting herself as a victim of corporate espionage and family betrayal. Her version of events portrayed me as a calculating predator who'd spent years gathering information and building resources specifically to destroy an innocent woman who'd tried to love me as her own daughter. She claimed I'd never gotten over the fact that Dad had remarried and had devoted my entire adult life to seeking revenge. The twins rallied their extensive social circle, painting me as a vindictive sociopath who'd orchestrated some elaborate revenge plot spanning decades. They started a social media campaign claiming I'd been planning this hostile takeover since childhood, gathering evidence and building resources specifically to destroy an innocent woman who tried to love me as her own daughter. They weren't entirely wrong about the planning part, though my motivations were more complex than simple revenge. I had indeed been building my business with the goal of eventually surpassing stepmom's success, but the opportunity to buy her company had been unexpected. The local business community was split into camps. Some admired my strategic thinking and business acumen, impressed by the audacity of acquiring a competitor and the resources required to pull off such a move. Others whispered about family loyalty and crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, questioning the ethics of using family connections to gain insider knowledge. Industry publications ran articles analyzing the acquisition from both business and personal perspectives. Some called it a brilliant strategic move that demonstrated exceptional business instincts. Others called it a cautionary tale about mixing family dynamics with business decisions and the dangers of letting personal grievances influence professional choices. The controversy generated significant media attention for my company, which turned out to be largely positive. Potential clients were impressed by the boldness of the move and the financial resources it demonstrated. Several major corporations reached out about consulting contracts, intrigued by the strategic thinking that had enabled such a dramatic acquisition. I didn't care about the gossip or the social fallout. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged, in control of my own destiny and wielding the power to shape my environment instead of just surviving it. The transition period was challenging but rewarding. I spent weeks interviewing employees to determine who was worth retaining and who had been enabled by stepmom's poor management practices. Many of the long-term employees were relieved by the change in leadership and eager to implement improvements they'd been suggesting for years. I discovered that several talented employees had been looking for other jobs because they were frustrated with the company's resistance to change and unwillingness to invest in modern technology. By addressing their concerns and providing them with the resources they needed, I was able to retain most of the valuable personnel. The worst employees, those who'd been promoted based on personal loyalty rather than competence, were terminated during the first month. These were typically people who'd made careers out of agreeing with stepmom and implementing her poor decisions without question. 6 months later, the company is thriving under my leadership in ways it never did under stepmom's management. I've retained most of the good employees while eliminating the deadweight and toxic personalities she'd enabled for years. We've upgraded all the technology, streamlined operations, and implemented modern management practices that actually make sense. I've landed 3 major contracts that stepmom could never have secured, partly because of my technical background and partly because clients respect competence over inherited authority. The first was a Fortune 500 company that needed to completely overhaul their digital marketing strategy. The second was a tech startup that needed traditional marketing expertise combined with digital innovation. The third was a government contract that required security clearances and technical certifications that stepmom's company had never bothered to obtain. Revenue is up 40% from the previous year, and we're profitable for the first time in 3 years. Employee satisfaction scores have improved dramatically, and we've received several industry awards for innovation and client service. Former clients who'd left during the company's decline are returning, impressed by the turnaround and the new direction. Industry publications that had written obituaries for the company are now featuring us as a comeback story and a case study in successful corporate transformation. The success is gratifying, but what's most satisfying is knowing that I've created something sustainable. This isn't just about proving a point or getting revenge. I've built a company that provides good jobs for talented people and delivers real value to clients. Last week, I received a letter from stepmom delivered by certified mail. She's working as a junior associate at a small firm across town, a humiliating come down from her previous position as owner and CEO. The job pays less than what I paid my entry-level employees, and she reports to people younger than the twins. The letter was 8 pages of accusations, justifications, and demands for a settlement to rectify this injustice, as she called it. She accused me of stealing her life's work, of manipulating her husband, of using illegal means to acquire information, and of destroying the legacy she'd built for the twins to inherit. She threatened legal action if I didn't agree to sell the company back to her at the original purchase price, demanded financial compensation for emotional distress, and suggested that my success was somehow illegitimate because it was built on her foundation. The letter revealed her complete inability to accept responsibility for her company's decline or acknowledge her role in our family's dysfunction. In her version of events, she was a victim of circumstances beyond her control, betrayed by an ungrateful stepdaughter who'd never appreciated the opportunities she'd been given. I read it once, carefully and completely, then fed it through the shredder without making copies or responding. Yesterday, Dad and I had lunch for the first time since the acquisition, meeting at a quiet restaurant where we could talk without interruption. He looks older, worn down by the divorce proceedings and the financial investigations that revealed the full extent of stepmom's embezzlement. The divorce has been particularly ugly, with stepmom claiming that Dad was complicit in my supposedly fraudulent acquisition of her company. She's demanded half of his assets and substantial alimony, arguing that she sacrificed her own career advancement to support his business interests. "Do you hate me?" he asked over coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the cup. "No," I said honestly, surprising myself with the realization. "I hate who I became trying to earn your approval. I hate the years I wasted believing I wasn't good enough. I hate the opportunities I missed because I was too busy trying to prove myself to people who were never going to validate me anyway. But I don't hate you. Can we fix this? Can we have some kind of relationship after everything that's happened? Maybe. But it starts with you understanding that I don't need your approval anymore. I never should have needed it in the first place." He nodded, tears in his eyes for the second time in our conversation. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I should have said that years ago, decades ago. You've accomplished more than I ever dreamed possible, and you did it entirely on your own. You should have said it when it mattered, when I was desperate to hear it and would have changed my entire life path for just a moment of recognition from you. I know. I can't undo that damage, but I want to try to build something new if you're willing." We talked for 2 hours, addressing 20 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. He explained his perspective, how overwhelmed he'd felt as a single father after mom died, how grateful he'd been when stepmom offered stability and guidance, how he'd convinced himself that her strict approach was what I needed to succeed in life. He admitted that he'd seen the favoritism, but had rationalized it as different parenting styles for different children. He told himself that I was stronger and more independent than the twins, that I could handle higher expectations and tougher love. The truth was simpler and more painful. He'd been a coward. He'd chosen the path of least resistance, sacrificing my emotional well-being to maintain peace in his marriage. Every time he'd failed to defend me, he'd made a conscious choice to prioritize his own comfort over my protection. "I appreciate the honesty," I told him, "but understanding your motivations doesn't erase the damage. I spent my entire childhood believing I wasn't worthy of love or protection because the 2 people who were supposed to care about me most treated me as expendable." He nodded, accepting the judgment without argument or excuses. "What can I do now?" he asked. "How can I make amends for 20 years of failing you?" "You can't," I said simply. "Some damage is permanent, but you can start by being honest about what happened instead of rewriting history to make yourself feel better." Over the following weeks, Dad proved surprisingly committed to making amends in whatever limited way was still possible. He gave depositions to investigators about stepmom's financial irregularities, providing evidence that helped build a case for fraud and embezzlement. He testified about the twins' inflated salaries and non-existent job responsibilities, confirming that they'd never actually worked for the company despite being on the payroll for years. Most importantly, he stopped making excuses for stepmom's behavior toward me. When relatives and family friends asked about our situation, he told them the truth about the favoritism and emotional abuse I'd endured. He stopped protecting her reputation at the expense of acknowledging my pain. The twins' reaction to their mother's downfall was predictably self-centered. Instead of examining their own complicity in the family dysfunction or expressing concern for the employees whose jobs had been endangered by their mother's mismanagement, they focused entirely on how the situation affected them personally. My stepbrother lost his apartment when stepmom could no longer subsidize his rent. He'd been working part-time at a gallery, confident that his trust fund would eventually provide the financial security he needed to pursue his artistic interests. With stepmom's assets frozen pending investigation and dad cutting off financial support, he was forced to move back home and find full-time employment for the first time in his life. My stepsister had to withdraw from graduate school when stepmom could no longer pay her tuition. She'd been pursuing a master's degree in art history with vague plans to work in museum curation someday. The program was expensive and prestigious, but provided no practical skills that would lead to immediate employment. Both twins blamed me for destroying their future prospects and forcing them to face adult responsibilities they'd never been prepared to handle. They seemed genuinely bewildered by the concept that their comfortable lifestyle had been funded by stolen money and that they might be held accountable for benefiting from their mother's crimes. 3 months after the acquisition, federal investigators arrested stepmom on charges of embezzlement, tax evasion, and wire fraud. The evidence I'd provided during due diligence had been turned over to law enforcement, leading to a comprehensive investigation of her financial activities. The arrest was covered extensively in local media, with particular attention paid to the family drama that had preceded it. Business publications ran detailed analyses of how family dysfunction had contributed to corporate mismanagement and eventual criminal behavior. Stepmom's mugshot appeared on the front page of the business section, a humiliating end to her carefully cultivated reputation as a successful entrepreneur. The article detailed her crimes in clinical language that stripped away any pretense of respectability or victim status. The twins hired a publicist to manage their image and distance themselves from their mother's criminal activities. They gave interviews portraying themselves as innocent victims who'd been unaware of their mother's illegal behavior and had suffered tremendously from my vindictive actions. Their strategy backfired spectacularly when investigators revealed that both twins had been receiving substantial payments from the company for years, despite performing no actual work. Bank records showed that they'd been aware these payments were irregular and had actively participated in concealing them from auditors. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, generating ongoing media attention that kept the story in the public eye. Stepmom's lawyers argued that she'd been a victim of circumstances beyond her control, driven to desperate measures by my systematic campaign to destroy her business. The prosecution painted a different picture. A woman who'd felt entitled to other people's money and had used her position of trust to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. The evidence was overwhelming, including detailed financial records, email correspondence, and testimony from company employees who'd witnessed her fraudulent activities. 6 months after her arrest, stepmom pleaded guilty to multiple felonies in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that would consume any remaining assets she hadn't already spent. The twins were charged with conspiracy and tax evasion, but received suspended sentences and community service in exchange for their cooperation with investigators. They were required to pay back the money they'd received from the company, which forced them to sell their cars, jewelry, and other luxury items their mother had bought them over the years. This morning, I walked through my office building, really my building now, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not validation or revenge or even satisfaction, though all of those emotions were present. Peace. The woman who spent decades telling me I'd never be successful enough, never be smart enough, never be worthy of the same love and respect she gave her biological children, now wears an orange jumpsuit and works in a prison laundry. She sees news coverage of my company's continued success from behind bars, watching the business she inherited and destroyed flourish under competent leadership. The twins who were held up as examples of everything I'd never become are now working entry-level jobs and living in studio apartments, struggling to rebuild lives they'd never been taught to maintain without someone else's money. They've learned the difference between inherited privilege and earned success, though the lesson came later and more harshly than it needed to. Dad, who chose harmony over justice for 20 years, is finally seeing the true cost of his passivity and the price his daughter paid for his refusal to protect her when she needed him most. He's in therapy now, working to understand how his choices shaped our family dynamics and contributed to the dysfunction that ultimately destroyed his marriage. I didn't buy this company to hurt them, though I won't pretend their suffering doesn't provide some measure of satisfaction. I bought it to finally stop hurting myself. For 20 years, I carried stepmom's voice in my head, telling me I wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough to deserve the same love and opportunities she gave her real children. That voice drove me to work 18-hour days, to sacrifice relationships and health and happiness in pursuit of an impossible standard of success that might finally earn me the validation I craved. Now I know the truth. The validation I was seeking was never available from her. She had no intention of ever seeing me as worthy, no matter what I accomplished. The game was rigged from the beginning, and the only winning move was to stop playing by her rules. I built my success not because of her motivation, but in spite of her sabotage. Every achievement was earned through my own determination, every client was won through my own competence, every dollar was made through my own labor and intelligence. She didn't make me strong, she made me desperate. The strength came from surviving her, from learning to value myself when no one else would, from refusing to accept her assessment of my worth as the final word on who I could become. The company I now own represents more than just a business acquisition or even poetic justice. It represents the moment I finally stopped trying to prove myself to people who were determined never to be impressed. It represents the moment I chose my own definition of success over theirs. Last week, I received a letter from a business magazine asking me to write an article about successful corporate turnarounds. They wanted me to share the strategies I'd used to transform stepmom's failing company into a profitable, growing business. I declined the interview. Some victories don't need to be publicized to be meaningful. The real measure of my success isn't the revenue growth or industry recognition or media attention. It's the fact that I sleep well at night, knowing I've built something valuable and sustainable. It's the satisfaction of providing good jobs for talented people and delivering real value to clients who trust my judgment. It's the peace that comes from finally silencing the voice that told me I'd never be enough. Tomorrow, I have a meeting with a potential client who's looking for help with a complicated digital transformation project. It's the kind of challenge I've always enjoyed. Complex, demanding, with high stakes and tight deadlines. 5 years ago, I would have approached this meeting desperate to prove myself, terrified of failure, driven by the need to validate my worth through external achievement. Now I'm approaching it as a competent professional who has something valuable to offer. Win or lose, the outcome won't define my self-worth or determine my identity. That's the real victory. Not buying stepmom's company or exposing her crimes or watching her face the consequences of her choices. The real victory is learning to value myself independently of her opinion. And that's worth more than any amount of money I paid for the privilege of writing this final chapter.